Order. This is meeting number 93 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I need to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those online, please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For interpretation online, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. I ask all participants to be careful when handling the earpieces in order to prevent feedback, which can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. Please speak only into the microphone your headset is plugged into, and place earbuds away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can and appreciate your patience and understanding. If any technical issues arise, please let me know immediately, and we will suspend to ensure interpretation is properly restored before resuming proceedings. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 6, 2024, the committee is beginning its study of free trade negotiations between Canada and Ecuador. We have a draft budget that's been circulated to all of the committee in the amount of $15,150. Is there any discussion on that? All those in support of the draft budget? Opposed? It carries. We have with us today Amnesty International Canada, Kathy Price, Latin America Campaigns Coordinator. Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Stuart Trow, Senior Researcher. From Cereals Canada, Mark Walker, Vice President, Markets and Trade. And from Mining Watch Canada, we have Vivian Herrera, Latin America Program Coordinator by video conference. Welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks and then proceed with rounds of questions. Ms. Price, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. The UN Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations has called on all states to negotiate only such international investment agreements that are compatible with their international human rights obligations. The UN Working Group also called on all states to conduct impact assessments of international investment agreements on human rights and the environment. Canada must comply with this recommendation to ensure that trade and investment objectives do not put human rights obligations at risk. So far, we have heard only that Canada's Trade Minister will table an economic impact assessment in Parliament alongside the text of any agreement reached with Ecuador. This suggests that human rights goals and Indigenous rights goals are not a serious consideration. They must be. We are equally concerned that while stakeholders in Canada were invited to a consultation about a possible FTA with Ecuador, human rights, environmental and Indigenous peoples organizations in Ecuador have been neither informed nor consulted. Canada says that mining and critical minerals are key areas for Canadian investment and avenues for growth in Ecuador. Those who will be impacted must be consulted. That's why we made space in our input to GAC's consultation for the voices of women human rights defenders with an organization called Amazonian Women Defenders of the Forest. These Indigenous women have faced death threats and attacks for speaking up about the impacts of resource extraction projects in their territories. This includes elevated levels of gender violence against women and girls, which have coincided with the arrival of mining and oil companies and militarization. This is what Amazonian women had to say in a public statement and want you to know. Currently, our rights and our territories are being seriously threatened by Canadian companies which do not respect the collective rights of Indigenous peoples and operate illegitimately in Indigenous territories. Without the participation and the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, a Canada-Ecuador free trade agreement would pose a clear violation to our rights, as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, ILO Convention 169, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples' rights are not respected in Ecuador, even though it is a party to ILO Convention 169 and other international instruments. Authorities and companies disregard Indigenous peoples' rights through policies and large-scale projects such as oil and mining that have not received their free, prior, and informed consent and that have affected their territories, environment, health, water, and food sources. Last May, Executive Decree 754 was issued. It allows mining companies to commence activities without Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office has expressed deep concern. There are other issues of deep concern. Companies are being allowed to continue to install climate-destroying gas flares on their oil platforms, despite a court ruling. Human rights defenders who speak out against irresponsible resource extraction suffer false accusations and attacks. Indigenous leader Eduardo Mendua was shot dead last February. Let me finish by sharing the words of Pablo Fajardo, an environmental defender who is at risk because of dangerous false accusations made against him by Ecuador's Minister of Energy and Mines. And this is what Pablo Fajardo authorized me to share with you. In all operations of Canadian companies in Ecuador, respect for human rights must come first. We cannot continue allowing more sacrifice zones. We are not against extractive activity necessarily. What we are against is the way things are being done now. The economic rights of corporations cannot be allowed to prevail over our rights to water, clean air, land, and community harmony. It is essential that this committee invites Pablo Fajardo and other witnesses from civil society organizations in Ecuador who will be impacted by a free trade agreement between Ecuador and Canada to provide input about the goals. This would be inclusive, progressive trade and investment. Thank you.
Mr. True, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much to the committee. On behalf of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I appreciate the chance to comment on possible free trade deal with Ecuador. While I will focus my comments on the possibility that a future deal includes an investor-state dispute settlement process, I would like to stress up front that I do not think these negotiations should proceed at all under the current civil emergency in Ecuador. It would be opportunistic for Canada to exploit the current crisis to fast-track a contentious free trade deal that Ecuadorian civil society groups know nothing about and will almost certainly not be consulted about over the course. The recently passed China-Ecuador trade deal was condemned by a large section of the Ecuadorian civil society, including the country's Confederation of Indigenous Nations, for the threats it poses to environment and the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially from mining and the expansion of monoculture commodities such as cacao, banana, and oil palm, which are responsible for significant amounts of deforestation in the country. These groups were not adequately consulted on that agreement, the China agreement, and they have not been consulted, as far as I know, on the possible Canadian FTA. In public statements, Canadian and Ecuadorian officials have said they want to pursue an inclusive trade agenda, as was just mentioned, that benefits workers, Indigenous peoples, and sustainable development. That will not be possible under the current circumstances in Ecuador, and it will not be possible under Canada's standard negotiating approach. Coming back to investment, there would be no chance of an inclusive trade deal if it includes a standard Canadian-style investment protection chapter and ISDS. A recent UN report states that the ISDS regime, quote, is not fit for purpose in the 21st century because it prioritizes the interests of foreign investors over the rights of states, human rights, and the environment, end quote. Our own government cited these same risks as the reason it excluded ISDS from the renegotiated Canada-US-Mexico agreement. But Ecuadorian ambassador to Canada recently, I guess a year ago now, told the Hill Times that he hopes a possible Canadian FTA includes ISDS, since he said this would attract more Canadian mining and related infrastructure, such as the roads and power that goes along with that. Negotiating new investment treaty protections with Ecuador would be a terrible idea, given Ecuador's traumatic experience with ISDS, including several infamous cases from Canadian mining companies over the past 2 decades, and considering the brave decision of the previous governments in Ecuador to pull the country out of the ISDS regime altogether after it found that the risks far outweigh the benefits. As proof of this finding, in fact, the termination of Canada's investment treaty with Ecuador in 2017 has not affected Canadian investment flows into the country. Canada is currently the largest foreign investor in Ecuador, and that's without having treaty protections in place. The option of disputing government decisions at ISDS tribunals instead of in domestic courts does not make projects more likely to move forward, but it can and frequently does undermine access to justice for local communities impacted by foreign investment. Their voices and their rights under international human rights, indigenous, and environmental treaties tend to be ignored by ISDS tribunals, even where countries raise them in their own defense. Large and growing ISDS awards into the billions of dollars can drain government funds from public services in extreme cases, as in Colombia, where money was moved from public services to pay for expensive ISDS claims. Because of Ecuador's terrible experience under ISDS, the constitution in that country prohibits the government from ratifying international treaties that incorporate investment arbitration. However, this didn't stop the previous Ecuadorian government from including ISDS in a free trade deal with Costa Rica. That deal is currently in limbo because the court declared it unconstitutional as a result of this constitutional ban on arbitration. So in conclusion, Canada should not launch negotiations with Ecuador until it is clear the Ecuadorian government has a social mandate to do so, in particular from Indigenous peoples and groups who are most impacted by foreign investment. There can be no inclusive trade deal with Ecuador if these voices are excluded from the discussion. Finally, ISDS should be a non-starter in any future negotiations. It contradicts the statements from the UN, it contradicts the government's own policy, and it may in fact be illegal under Ecuador's constitution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walker, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for having me here today on Canada's Agriculture Day. My name is Mark Walker. I'm the Vice President of Markets and Trade with Cereals Canada. Cereals Canada is the National Industry Association for wheat, durum, barley, and oats in Canada. We represent the full value chain from farmers to crop development companies, grain handlers, and exporters. Our members focus on the benefits of export-led growth facilitated by access to diverse global markets. Canadian cereals are a staple food exported around the world to over 80 different countries. In an average year, our wheat, durum, barley, and oats sector generates $68.8 billion in economic activity in Canada, including more than 370,000 Canadian jobs. Wheat production in Ecuador is insignificant. Their milling industry depends on imports to mill high-quality bread flour. Canada's cereals industry has established itself as Ecuador's leading wheat supplier and holds a 60% market share on imported wheat. Our industry views Ecuador as a market with significant growth potential. During the last 5 years, Ecuador's average annual imports of Canadian wheat were valued at over 285 million Canadian dollars, a consistent top 10 export market for our industry. The nearly 750,000 metric tons of Canadian cereals exports to Ecuador each year account for 55% of Canada's exports to that country. Cereals Canada supports bilateral trade negotiations with Ecuador to remove any remaining cereal import tariffs and cement a rules-based trading system that protects market access for high-quality Canadian cereals. A key opportunity for free trade agreement, or FTA, negotiations is the removal of remaining duties on Canadian oat imports. Ecuador retains an ad valorem tariff of 5% on oats other than those used for seed. Canada currently is the primary oat exporter in the Americas, and increasing market access to Ecuador will support market diversification of Canadian oat exports in South America. Our sector has been supportive of the government's work to grow FTAs. These agreements have worked to reduce cereal import tariffs in the relatively few remaining markets where these tariffs still exist. The Canadian cereals industry has witnessed a shift in trade barriers from tariff-based to non-tariff-based, or NTBs, as the primary means of controlling imports. Unfortunately, there have been instances where, despite an FTA, market access has not increased. In these cases, the use of NTBs frustrate potential gains from an FTA. While Canada has been able to grow our market share in Ecuador, experience in other wheat importing markets such as Peru have shown that the imposition of import barriers through non-tariff measures remains a concern. In other regional markets such as Mexico, we have seen government policy move away from science-based decisions and towards import restrictions on safe agricultural technologies. When negotiating future trade agreements and in implementing already agreed to FTAs, Canadian trade officials, who do fantastic work, by the way, must increase their focus on including provisions governing the use of non-tariff barriers, risk-based scientific assessments, and timely binding dispute resolution processes to reopen borders when barriers are put in place. These provisions would create the framework for a fourth-generation trade agreement, if you will. Canadian government and officials must continue to support the use of harmonized, science-based standards relating to maximum residue limits, or MRLs. Science-backed MRLs harmonized at levels consistent with international guidance, such as Codex Alimentarius, provide transparent levels that protect consumers and support predictable trade. Canada's negotiators must recognize the trade restrictive impact of setting MRLs and import tolerances at levels below harmonized international standards, and the market access obstacles this would create if Ecuador were to adopt this approach. An effective binding dispute resolution mechanism to address non-tariff barriers, such as those based on sanitary and phytosanitary or SPS issues, would be an important outcome in bilateral Canada-Ecuador negotiations. Canada's trade agreements should seek to provide an enhanced mechanism to effectively address these types of concerns. Rather than resorting to a multi-year international arbitration to determine whether an SPS claim is valid or not, as I'm sure committee members can appreciate, that would be quite challenging, a mechanism where a panel of scientific experts who can be quickly convened to consider the issue and quickly rule on whether there is a scientific basis would be a preferable outcome in this sort of agreement. A bilateral trade agreement that includes good regulatory practices for non-tariff barriers will foster a stronger, predictable trade environment with Ecuador that allows food to reach markets where it is needed and contribute to global food security. On behalf of our members, Cereals Canada expresses our gratitude to the committee. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the interest in learning about the opportunities for a potential Canada-Ecuador free trade agreement. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. Ms. Herrera, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to members of the committee for inviting us to this hearing. Mining Watch Canada is a Canadian organization that for over 2 decades has worked in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous communities struggling to protect their lives and territories from human rights abuses and environmental damage across Canada and by Canadian mining companies operating internationally. Our partners in Ecuador are concerned about the lack of transparency and consultation regarding a free trade agreement between Canada and Ecuador. In a statement signed by our partners and other Ecuadorian social and environmental organizations, they talk of high levels of socio-environmental conflicts related to territories where Canadian mining is active. They say that these territories, quote, are treated as sacrificial, a mentality which will be even more difficult to reverse if a free trade agreement further cements legal protections for these investments, unquote. A central focus of this free trade agreement will be support for foreign investment in mining. Given the often violent imposition of mining development in Ecuador, it can be anticipated that a free trade agreement with Ecuador will exacerbate environmental conflicts, human rights violations, the militarization of territories, and threats and intimidation against Indigenous leaders who speak out against Canadian mining projects. Meanwhile, Canada still has no meaningful mechanism to prevent or provide redress for such abuses. The most recent cases of violence related to Canadian mining in Ecuador involve Adventus Mining and Natico Mining. In July 2023, just a few months ago, in an attempt to impose pro-mining Executive Decree 754, vast police repression and intimidation were unleashed against Indigenous and Campesino communities opposing these two companies' activities. Volker Turk, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, expressed his concern over the violence and condemned the decree that allowed companies to start mining operations without free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous communities. He said, quote, "People directly affected by mining projects or activities must be heard, not repressed." Unquote. The Canadian Embassy had visited both mining sites in a visit organized by the mining companies just a few weeks before the military crackdown and failed to denounce the violence. Despite a large movement, social movement against Canadian mining in Ecuador, Canadian mining companies and embassy officials have been actively involved in promoting the expansion of Canadian mining projects in the country, undermining indigenous self-determination. For example, in southern Ecuador, in a citizen-led initiative in 2021, 80% of residents of Cuenca voted in favor of protecting water and against industrial mining in a fragile ecosystem that supplies water to tens of thousands of people in and around the city of Cuenca. In the Amazon, in 2019, the indigenous Shuar-Arutan people declared their territory free of mining and that the right to say no to mining projects must be respected. Canadian Dundee Precious Metals and Solaris Resources continue to pursue these projects despite this clear rejection. A free trade agreement that will enhance corporate access to markets and capital would lead to greater impunity for Canadian mining companies that violate human rights, given that no mechanism currently exists in Canada to hold these companies accountable for such abuses. Another major concern is the inclusion of an investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS mechanism commonly used by Canadian mining companies to sue countries in private supranational tribunals, for example, if they are denied mining permits. This restricts governments' ability to deny permits to protect their territories and water or the human rights of their citizens. Therefore, Canada must take ISDF off the table. As the Canadian government gets ready to initiate conversations with its Ecuadorian counterpart, we call on the Canadian government to halt diplomatic support for Canadian mining investments in territories which have already said no to mining. No free trade agreement should advance without Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent. Canada suffers from a lack of accountability in its mining sector. As such, Canada should not advance any new trade with Ecuador without an empowered, independent Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise and without having enacted rigorous human rights and environmental due diligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to the members of the committee. Mr. Genero for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witness. Happy Agriculture Day as well, and thank you to my fellow members of Parliament on my side for letting me go first as well in this important study. I would like to start with, if we could, look at some of the exports, the top 3 exports to Ecuador, and I have them listed as wheat at 299.3 million, refined oil at 164.8 million. And then vegetables at 34.7 million. And Mr. Walker, you mentioned that concerned about the non-tariff trade barriers, particularly on cereal and the 5% on oats. I guess one, have you seen any signs that this is something that the government is considering, not considering in some of your early discussions, but also if perhaps weigh in now would be a great opportunity to make sure that the government's aware of some of those concerns, maybe in a bit more detail.
Thank you for the question. Madam Chair, I would respond by highlighting our fairly consistent asks both at this committee as well as to trade officials. We see the government's trade agenda as a great opportunity to build in these structures within these agreements to make sure that reliable dispute resolutions available across SPS measures to make sure that it's binding, it's timely, and that it's effective.
Great. So that it's also Ecuador, the share of exports by province and territory. My home province is of Alberta is very high, 44.6% of the exports. That's 269.2 million. However, we've seen a recent trade agreement come through that really focused heavily on implementing a carbon tax within the country. We're concerned and watching this closely, obviously, that this might be potentially for future trade deals. Is there any indication that you've seen, Mr. Walker, in some of your work? As we know, Ecuador, the government, the last time they attempted to remove a fossil fuel subsidy from gasoline and diesel, there were riots and the army had to be called in. I can only imagine something like a carbon tax would be untenable in a situation like this.
So it's not been our experience that prices on carbon taxes would be a standard clause in a trade agreement. Generally we would be cautious and wary of sustainability provisions making their way into a trade agreement. Our industry, as I mentioned, supports export-led growth, and we would want to see that continue within any future trade agreements.
Great. And so if we get back to some of the non-tariff trade barrier concerns, just to be clear, you're supportive of removing the 5% on oats. Is this something you've seen success in other trade agreements that we can reference?
Yeah, thank you for the question. To us, tariff-free access is becoming table stakes. The government has done a good job of negotiating with the negotiators down to levels that are, virtually tariff-free. So that is becoming an expectation that we would want to see continue. We believe that removing the tariff on oats will, have significant impacts on exports to Ecuador and then throughout the region as well. It is a growing market for oats and one that we would look to see continue.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I just curious if there's other examples that point the negotiators to, perhaps that's a good example that they can follow.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so are there other examples of other free trade agreements that you could point to that this is a good example for these negotiators to follow?
Definitely, yeah. The Canada-UK FTA that was being negotiated, we have tariff-free access under the Trade Continuity Agreement, which we're happy to see continue. We were looking to that agreement to see improved, dispute resolutions on a variety of SPS issues, and we look forward to those negotiations continuing.
Great. So the other products with high tariffs include textiles, vehicles, agricultural goods. We sometimes see those tariffs at 11.2% in 2021. I really think that this is obviously it's an opportunity to lead by example. We're certainly supportive of some of these barriers being discussed and implemented removed as part of this trade agreement. I guess allowing you the opportunity to share why that's important, particularly to the cereals community, but the agricultural community in general. I guess I have 50 seconds left, but I'll turn it over to you to kind of do that.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so tariff-free access, Canadian agricultural products compete as premium goods. They're not very price competitive. So the lower tariffs we have, the better we do. Canadian farmers produce some of the most fantastic crops in the world, and having tariff-free access allows us to maintain and create new markets.
Yeah. Thanks.
Mr. Rial, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome and thank all the witnesses for being here today. Mark, it's also good to see you, and happy Agriculture Day to all the farmers and members of the agriculture sector in Canada to put food on our tables. And I also had the pleasure to visit Cereal Canada in Winnipeg last summer to talk about the importance of my private member's bill, Bill C-244, for our agriculture sector in Canada. And I know Cereal Canada provides service for cereals producer across Canada, from advocacy to market support. And if anyone had a chance to visit, your lab is very impressive. I understand cereals are important in our agriculture exports and with an annual export value of over 10 billion. And in terms of Ecuador, cereals are ranked the highest value Canadian export in 2022. And when I visit the wheat field in Paris over the summer, some of the farmers have shared with me the damage climate change has caused to them, especially on the harvesting side and the agriculture, agri-food sector as a whole. While we are advancing in building more climate resilient economy and diversification is also very important. So through the chair, I'd like to ask Mark, could you share with the committee the importance of trade diversification for our cereal sector?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I would respond that, of course, trade diversification is of critical importance to our industry. We are exporting to over 84 countries around the world. We are working very closely, hand in glove, with our Canadian trade commissioners who do fantastic work every day. But what I will say, in terms of roles for government, we've also seen fantastic work done here domestically in terms of supports for Canadian agriculture, whether that's enabling regulations for pest control products, whether that's investments in innovative technologies like zero-tillage, minimum tillage. Those collaborative efforts with government really are insulating our industry against the impacts of climate change.
And Mark, do you think a free trade agreement with Ecuador will help with the diversifications?
Absolutely. I mentioned the 5% tariff on oats. Seeing that removed through these negotiations will certainly help diversify our oat markets. Canada is the largest oat exporter to the Americas, and so securing that market for further exports will certainly be very beneficial.
And in terms of the increase in extreme climate events that's happening right now throughout Canada and continually taking place, in the prairies and across Canada, will trade diversification help the cereal sectors to have more choices of export destinations and generate more revenue that can be reinvested into the sector to help them recover from extreme climate events?
Thank you for the question. So, looking at extreme climate events in Canada, we regularly experience in the Western Prairies, in the Prairie provinces, cyclical droughts. We had one a few years ago. Certainly, trade diversification is very helpful, to increase value add for our products. As I mentioned, they compete at a premium. But the investment that's needed, the reinvestments that's needed, we are seeing, and in fact, our sector has become increasingly resilient. Whereas droughts that would have crippled it, some 40 years ago, due to some of the innovations I mentioned previously, we're able to bounce back and not lose the yields that we would have previously because of the innovation in our sector.
And will this free trade agreement with Ecuador help with that?
Yes, unquestionably. We're very supportive of the free trade negotiations.
So the next question I have is regarding on Global Fair Trade Commissioner Service that has identified agriculture export as a key growth sector for the future of Canada-Ecuador bilateral trade. Has your organization done any analysis on how opening access to the Ecuadorian market will impact your association and your members?
So our group regularly travels to Ecuador every year to meet with our customers there in the milling industry and work with them on the functional characteristics of the harvest each year, which can vary from year to year. Wheat is not wheat. We know this. And so certainly improved, deepened ties with that country will allow us to work more efficiently with our customers and market.
And can you share a little bit more on how we can advance this free trade agreement to make sure that not just the agriculture sector is looked after, but all other sectors across Canada is also benefit from this trade agreement?
So I trying to maintain my agriculture hat as much as I can. Unquestionably, there are spillover benefits for for a strong agriculture sector in Canada. I mentioned the 370,000 jobs that are supported directly and indirectly by our industry. We would, of course, expect spillover effects to other areas of the economy from a strong agriculture sector.
Thank you for sharing that with me.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Merci à l'ensemble des témoins pour vos
Thank you to all our witnesses for your presentations. We know that three of your presentations are quite complementary. There's another one, Mr. Walker's, focused more on the purely commercial aspect, that is the harmonization of standards, and we've taken due note of these. But the other three presentations show us that the issue of human rights and human beings should be the blind spot of developing trade relations, which are desirable, but of course not at any price. My first question is for you, Ms. Price. In your presentation, you gave us a general, very worrisome picture of the situation in Ecuador. However, I'd like to hear your recommendations. What should we keep an eye on, and what would you like to see or not in a possible trade agreement?
Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you for the observation that, yes, indeed, it is a very worrying panorama in Ecuador at this moment in time, a panorama that in many ways is becoming more acute. From the perspective of my organization, Amnesty International, I come to this hearing with a number of recommendations. The first is that Canada guarantee that no free trade agreement with Ecuador will advance without broad, transparent, meaningful consultation with affected Indigenous peoples in Ecuador, creating conditions for and ensuring the participation of Indigenous women and their organizations, including Amazonian women, defenders of the forest, and other Indigenous organizations in this consultation, and that no agreement advances without their free, prior, and informed consent. This recommendation comes from compliance with Canada's human rights obligations and ensuring that trade and investment is not taking precedence over human rights and undermining human rights. The second recommendation is for Canada to comply with the recommendations of the UN Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations, which I referenced in my comments. This means ensuring that there is no investor-state dispute settlement provisions, which my colleague has really spelled out. But this is a recommendation of the UN Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations. And the second is to ensure what's referred to as ex-ante and ex-post human rights impact assessments in line with UN guidelines, paying particular attention to the impact on Indigenous peoples, racialized people, women, and girls. And the third recommendation is to ensure that there is mandatory human rights and environment due diligence through a legal framework enshrined in legislation, and along with that, access to remedy when rights are breached by Canadian companies operating in Ecuador or really anywhere around the world. So our recommendation is that you not proceed without any of these conditions that I have presented to you.
Dans ce cas, écoutez, souvent, le gouvernement va...
Often, the government will put forward the fact that in most of the agreements that have been signed, that there are chapters on human rights. However, these chapters are never binding. Simply, these are references to principles, and there is never any actual authority mechanism put in place. In fact, we were able to amend the Ukraine Free Trade Agreement law to add a binding provisions. But I imagine that it's better to have all of these chapters than not having them. These are good principles, so it's better to have them than not to have them. But does this reassure you to have them if there's nothing to further implement them?
Thank you again for that question. No, there has to be implementation. There has to be carry through, and this is also why we are recommending that there be human rights impact assessments before and after at regular intervals. This is a recommendation of the UN Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations. It's also a recommendation of the UN Rapporteur on the right to food, for example. And so we don't have that. We do not have that at present with our free trade agreements. This has to be a necessary component in a free trade agreement.
Mais
And
pour,
without it, we should not be moving ahead.
pour les négocier à l'étranger, je crois qu'il
Yes, but
faudrait...
to negotiate them with other countries, I imagine that we first need to have legislation here. Are you satisfied with existing legislation in Canada with respect to forced labor, for the behavior of Canadian companies, etc.? Do you believe that maybe we could go a little bit further to begin to say that at least we have the beginning of something here?
We're not satisfied with the status quo, absolutely not. That's why we have been advocating for strengthened powers for the Ombuds Office and for binding legislation, binding human rights and environment due diligence, which we lack.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here today. It's been very interesting. I wish we literally had all day to speak to you. But I'm going to start with Mr. True. You had some strong words about what Canada's role should be here, what Canada's direction should be in these negotiations, literally to stop them. And a lot of this centers around the combination of these ISDS mechanisms and free trade agreements, along with the track record on human rights in many countries, especially in Latin America. And you mentioned that Ecuador had tried to get out of all its free trade agreements in 2017 after it was hit with a $2 billion claim through an ISDS process, I think Occidental Petroleum. I'm just wondering if you could just dive into this whole thing and why we can't get this right, why ISDS provisions always end up badly for countries, and especially for the people that are being affected by these Canadian investments in them, and vice versa. Even in Canada, we are getting hit with ISDS claims by other companies. So if you could just dive into that, why we can't get it right, and what you would suggest we do.
Well, I appreciate that question very much. I don't know I don't know why we can't get it right. I mean, I think we did get it right in the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. We simply agreed to get rid of ISDS in that new agreement, and made a big deal out of it when the deal was announced, saying because it undermines our ability to pass environmental policies. A lot of lawsuits, and across Latin America, it's a major issue, ISDS. A number of corporate cases involving public services, certainly involving Canadian mining companies abroad. So Canada's the 12th biggest economy in the world, but we're the 4th most litigious country when it comes to companies using ISDS to challenge environmental decisions in other countries, challenge with respect to mining permits and whatnot. I mean, for all the reasons I think this committee's talked about before, it's a pretty lopsided system. Voices of people who would be impacted by investments are really not considered. You know, you can put in an application through an Amici, to put in an Amici submission into these cases. They're frequently turned down. When they are accepted, they're frequently ignored by the tribunal. There's simply no way to get into the discussion other issues other than the investor's desires to make a profit and the state's responsibilities in the treaty to that investor. So it's problematic for a number of other reasons, but those are the basics.
And if you could just, I mean, as you mentioned how we got out of it in the CUSMA agreement, and Chrystia Freeland said that, ISDS elevates the rights of corporations over those of sovereign governments. In removing it, we have strengthened our government's right to regulate in the public interest. So why don't we do that every time, is my question. But lately we've been putting other language into FTAs that says at the start of all this, nothing in this agreement, affects either of the parties' right to bring in legislation in their own public interest, in environmental interests, human rights, whatever. And yet it doesn't seem to work. Can you maybe mention some of the cases there and what the problem is?
Yeah, so I think the language you're referring to would maybe some of the right to regulate clauses that Canada started putting into agreements like the CIIT and its model investment treaty from 2021. Those, I would say, are completely untested. Like, we haven't seen cases under those agreements because they're not enforced yet. But the results of, there's an Ottawa book that came out a few years ago now that looked into modern language, some of the more modern treaties that Canada has been pursuing in other countries as well, that tries to strengthen right to regulate provisions. And it's not been highly effective. Like, in ISDS panels will use older treaties as a basis for the standards that these investors have in other countries, right? And so that's one of the reasons you get these new treaties, but their decisions are being based on kind of older reasoning.
1 minute. Okay, I'm going to turn to Ms. Herrera with Mining Watch and just maybe ask you, Ms. Herrera, to comment on these issues in a real Ecuadorian context. What has the history been with Canadian companies or other companies in an Ecuadorian context? The idea that we have Ecuadorian communities who have really expressed their concerns about activities, and yet they have been ignored by Canadian companies.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So what we know from our work in Ecuador is that there are at least 15 Canadian mining companies trying to advance mining projects in Ecuador. Most of these projects are known for their social environmental impacts. Most of them are denounced by indigenous and campesino communities because of their environmental impacts. And why is that? The reason for that is that most of these projects are located in very ecologically sensitive areas, meaning in the Amazon, also in the Paramos. The Paramos are one of the most unique ecosystems in the Andes in South America. These ecosystems, the Paramos, the Amazon, as you know, are vital in our fight against climate change. And yet, these are the territories, these are the areas where Canadian mining is trying to advance mining projects. Because of that, communities are saying no, we don't want these destructive mining projects in our territories that are gonna, not only are gonna destroy the territory, but are gonna contaminate our water. And also, cause that division within the communities. That's what we hear from communities over
Ms.
there.
Herrera, thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt, but I have to move on to the next member of the committee. Thank you, though. Mr. Seaback?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Walker, I'm just wondering, so cereals is the largest export or trade with Ecuador. If I look at the charts, somewhere between $300 to $400 million per year. That's look at 2022 cereals, somewhere in the range of, looks like 300 and something, wheat being the largest part of that, it looks like. Do you have any estimate of how much trade would actually increase in a free trade agreement? Would we go from 300 million to 350 million? 300 million to 400 million? I'm just trying to get a sense of where this is going.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So we would expect, given the growth that we've experienced in the last 5 years in the market, for that to continue. But what we see in this agreement is fundamentally a defensive exercise. I mentioned the SPS binding resolution, the need for science-based within the agreement, making sure that we can maintain the market as much as see those tariff reductions is as much a goal here as anything else.
So you don't see a huge increase in cereals exports. It's more of we want to just maintain where we are. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, given the rise of non-tariff barriers within existing trade agreements, we are very concerned about that. We would look to buttress efforts in that area to ensure that we can maintain the market. I believe it is likely we could see continued growth in the market.
Right. So when I look at Canada's trade, I think our exports are somewhere, I mean, last we have is from the government's 2022, 940 billion. So if we go up, 30 or 40 million in trade with Ecuador, that's kind of a rounding error in enhancements of trade, which kind of leads me to the question of which is why are we here? There's so many trade issues that the government has. We did a study on non-tariff barriers and existing free trade agreements. Those barriers are worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. But the government is choosing to focus on a free trade agreement with Ecuador. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm just wondering if either of the other witnesses, Mr. True or Ms. Price, do you have any idea why the government is deciding to pursue this free trade agreement?
I can answer that. Thanks for the question. I think possibly because Ecuador asked them to, and this may be a bit of a pull side for them. And there probably are political reasons for that, maybe ideological reasons in Ecuador among the current government, but I think you're right that there's not a lot in this for Canada in terms of new export access.
I have no comments.
Okay. And I have no more questions. Thank you.
Mr. Aria, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Walker, happy Agriculture Day. Canadian farmers, they are very small in number, but they all make us proud. They have made Canada the 5th largest exporter of agriculture, produce, and agri-food products in the world. The prosperity that we enjoy today is mainly due to the trade that the farmers, including farmers, others export. We 67.4% of the GDP in 2022 came from international trade. So it is the international trade that gives us the prosperity that we enjoy today. And for us, every single trade agreement is important. We have trade agreement with, I think, we have got 15 trade agreements with about 51 countries, covering about 60% of the world GDP. And we need more of that. We need every small bit helps. And we also need to diversify from the export that we are focused. We are mostly trading with our biggest neighbor, US, and we need to diversify our exports. And that is one reason why we need to have as many trade agreements as possible with different countries in different parts of the world. And, to hear some people say, not my colleagues here, but some of the witnesses seems to indicate that we should not have trade negotiations until certain conditions are met. Many times they don't understand that the trade agreements is required, especially for countries like Ecuador, though it is an upper middle income country, but it's still a developing country. There's still a lot of people in the lower poor and lower income group. And the trade agreements like this will stimulate economic investments. And it has become very fashionable in Canada to pick on our mining companies. Our mining companies, they take their corporate responsibility quite seriously. But I do agree that there are mining companies in developing countries, in poor countries, which are from other countries who exploit wherever they set up the mines, but to apply the same and paint the Canadian mining companies in the same brush, I think it is not good for Canada. I think we forget that the trade agreements and the investments from whether the agriculture companies or the mining companies, they not only stimulate economic growth wherever they invest in, they also provide for the development of social infrastructure, from roads to schools to power generation. When I grew up in a country we did not have trade agreements, every summer I used to spend 2 months in our village. We did not have toilets or running water. And I wish the country had trade agreements where foreign investors can come and invest in the local economy, create jobs, and help in economic improvement. Anyway, Mr. Walker, coming back to the agriculture sector, Ecuador is maybe a small market, but tell me, how does it help in the medium to longer term to stimulate Canadian exports to the region as a whole?
Thank you for the question. Really, we view this agreement as a significant opportunity to solidify the market access that we have in Ecuador. For our industry, market maintenance is just as important as market development. We have seen throughout the region an increasing derogation from science-based trading principles. I mentioned Mexico in my remarks. I mentioned Peru. And ensuring that those frameworks are in place within this agreement to resolve disputes based on science, to have agreed upon procedures to resolve them in a timely manner is really essential.
Another thing, whenever Ecuador had gone through various upheavals in its life, it has been an independent country for a very long time. It left OPEC and joined back as the OPEC member, I think, in 2020, if I'm not wrong. Whether it is at the request of Canada or at the request of Ecuador, this trade agreement is being negotiated. I just want to touch on the investor-state dispute settlement. Listen, at the end of the day, in my view, Canada has to do what is good for Canada, Canadian economy, and Canadian companies. And that is what our trade negotiators have been doing. And I hope they continue to focus that on mind. I think my time is up, Madam Chair.
You have 9 seconds. Thank you very much. Mr. Savard Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Bon, mais, écoutez, M. Truitt, étant donné que sa dernier commentaire.
Mr. Truitt, that's the last comment, an opinion rather than a question. I encourage you to continue to work on that issue of the ISDS. As my colleague said, the negotiators are going to continue to do that. However, in the case of the ACIO, there was not a chapter on that. This famous NAFTA Chapter 11 that we called it, now you're invited to eliminate that type of provision in future agreements, and I agree 100% with you. However, we have to acknowledge that in recent agreements, the challenge, the definition was more restrictive than what we had in the NAFTA. The NAFTA one made it possible to do all kinds of things. In this case, if we have a definition that's more restrictive, why is it still too much in your opinion?
Sorry, can you please ask the last part there? Are you saying in the new language, some of the new language we have?
Oui, disons que la RDI.
Let's say the ISDS, as defined in some of the more recent agreements, was more restrictive and allowed fewer abuses than in the time of the NAFTA. Why do you think it's still too much?
Okay, I think I understand. Thank you for the question. It's to me, the question is, the language is still not restrictive enough, and it leaves way too much room for arbitrators to continue to decide on cases based on their own standards, right, with respect to what has become the customary international law norms with respect to investment protection. We see this all the time in cases. And there's still no requirement in Canada's modernized FIPA from 2021 to take into account other obligations on states, whether it comes to Indigenous peoples or the environment. It's still a one-sided process. Only states can bring cases against governments. You can't have counterclaims against the companies. There's all kinds of reasons. It's still the standard ISDS model. And if you look at some of the more recent cases against Canada under USMCA, right, under the new CUSMA, like this $20 billion claim from Ruby River against Canada for this cancellation, or the non-approval of an LNG plant in Quebec. They're not using they're using the new language. They're using the CIIT language to make a case against Canada, right? So even under these new treaties with this new language, the threat is clearly still there. Somebody still thinks there's a strong case. And so we're going to see the same kind of cases popping up again and again. Yeah.
En fait, vous avez dit j'utilise le CETA, je pense que vous vouliez dire j'utilise l'ACEUM, plutôt le CUSMA.
Oh, le CUSMA, OK.
Oui, c'est ça. Yeah. Mais et si je ne m'abuse, en fait, concernant la poursuite entourant GNL...
Concerning the LNG in Quebec, isn't it more because of the transition clause?
Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to continue with Ms. Herrera just to talk about, we've heard from other witnesses, including Amnesty International, Ms. Price, about the fact that this government in Canada has instituted United Nations Direct Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People legislation. We talk about free, prior, and informed consent. We talk about meaningful consultation here in Canada in a very serious way. The courts have agreed, and yet abroad we seem to forget all that. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that in this context, about what the Canadian government is saying outside Canada, what the Canadian embassy is saying in Ecuador, for instance, with regards to these principles that this government rightly, I think, holds so dear.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Well, in terms of what is the Canadian Embassy in Ecuador, in Quito, saying about this, what we find is that there, as before, there's still this promotion of mining, of Canadian mining in Ecuador. But what we've seen in the last year or so is, like this tendency to emphasize that what Canada brings to a table is responsible mining, right? The language of responsible, sustainable mining that is focused on, women's rights, etc. However, there's a huge gap between, what the Canadian embassy says in Ecuador, and also I will also add what Canadian mining companies say in Ecuador and what actually happens on the ground. On the ground, that's where communities affected by Canadian mining, what they're seeing is a very different story. What they're seeing is that even though there's this talk about human rights respect towards indigenous peoples, in fact, that's not happening. For example, as I mentioned in the Amazon, with the Shuararutan people, there's the Canadian mining company, Solaris Resources, who's trying to advance the Warinsa project in the Amazon, a vital area in order to fight against climate change. This area, the company is trying to advance a project without consent by the indigenous communities. The company claims to have acquired the consent of the indigenous communities, but they've only talked to 2 out of 47 indigenous Shuar communities. In all of this, we see the Canadian ambassador, for example, not denouncing the violence that communities face in Ecuador. So because of this, we feel that we see how we see this diplomatic support towards mining companies over the safety and human rights of communities. And one thing that we fear, that we're very concerned about this free trade agreement, is that this situation is gonna worsen if a free trade agreement is signed, because that would mean more mining investment in Ecuador. And as
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt you again. Okay. Mr. Martel for 5 minutes.
Thank you for being present. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker, I noticed that in 2022, Quebec contributed only 6.8% of world imports to Ecuador, compared to what Alberta contributed and Manitoba. So I'm asking myself, do you think that Quebec has reached its limits when it comes to exports, especially when it comes to cereals? Or is there anything else that we could develop in Canada to improve our exports?
For the question, I would say that there is a distinction between Western and Eastern wheats. Eastern wheats that are exported from Ontario and Quebec do quite well in Latin America, just based on the dietary preferences and different end-use products that are consumed there. So we do see growth in Latin American countries for both, wheat and cereals from Ontario as well as Quebec.
According to you, Mr. Walker, what are the obstacles? What should we be negotiating during this free trade agreement in order to protect the rights of or protect the products of exporters in Canada?
Thank you for the question. As I've said, we see this agreement as a great opportunity to strengthen various processes within Canada's free trade agreements, and we would look to our negotiators as well as the government to build on that. Binding dispute resolution processes, recognition for the importance of science-based decision-making. These are all areas where we would welcome engagement from our negotiators.
As my last question is, how would a free trade agreement between Canada and Ecuador be able to increase the access to the market and increase the value of Canadian wheat exports?
The question. So as I've mentioned, there is the 5% tariff on oats. There is not a large, but a persistent market demand in Ecuador for Canadian oats, and so we would expect, that it is an abiding and persistent one. We would expect to see that grow with the reduction of that tariff.
That's all for me. Thank you much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Mr. Sidhu, for 5 minutes, please.
And thanks to our witnesses for being here today. As we all know, South America is a very important region, a growing region in the world for Canada. Having traveled to the region over the last 2 years as Parliamentary Secretary at Global Affairs, I've seen and heard firsthand from Canadian companies operating in the region, and I understand there's tremendous growth opportunities. Two-way trade is over $20 billion and support thousands of jobs here in Canada. We have multiple free trade agreements with countries in the region, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Honduras, Panama, and Peru, to name a few. Trade in the region create opportunities for many Canadian sectors, as we heard today, including clean tech and technology, energy, science, technology, and innovation, life sciences, agriculture, and agri-food. We heard Mr. Walker in his opening remarks mention that our trade agreement supports over 370,000 jobs directly and indirectly in the sector he highlighted through trade and local as well. In the growing clean tech and renewable sector, we have jobs that are growing exponentially here in Canada, and our government is focused on building on that growth and momentum to unlock even more markets around the world. Mr. Walker, you mentioned in your opening remarks that Ecuador presents potential for Canadian trade and industry. Can you speak to the impacts that our ambitious free trade agreements have helped your industry and, of course, achieve growth and trade diversity through markets around the world?
Thank you for the question. As has been noted in my remarks, we are supportive of the government's trade agenda. I would note that the Canadian cereals industry supports $68.8 billion in economic activity, as well as 370,000 Canadian jobs. The potential for growth within this agreement, I mentioned oats previously. I noted also that we are seeing trade increasing given the tariff-free access that currently exists for wheat. We do see this as a potentially defensive exercise with this agreement, given the slide within the region with existing trade agreement partners, Mexico and Peru, constructing non-tariff barriers. So really making sure that we get those processes in this agreement right to make sure that we can maintain that market as a top 10 export market for Canadian cereals is very important for us.
You mentioned your association or your organization has traveled to Ecuador almost yearly. What are you seeing on the ground there in terms of your conversations with industry stakeholders?
They love Canadian wheat. Canadian farmers do fantastic work year after year. We're very proud to be able to represent them along with our industry partners. They have nothing but the best things to say about our products.
Okay, and other than wheat, do you support agri-food industry as well? I know in the city that I represent in Brampton, we have a huge agri-food industry. What are you seeing there? Is there potential there as well?
So Cereals Canada represents farmers, crop development companies, exporters, and grain handlers. We see growth in Ecuador for value-added products, so we will work with millers as well as bakers in that country to help demonstrate the various uses for Canadian products so that they can make the best use of the product when they receive it. So we do support agri-food abroad as well.
Thank you for that. Madam Speaker, how much time do I have left? Half a minute. Okay. My next question is for Ms. Price. Ms. Price, you had mentioned the importance to include Indigenous peoples in trade agreements to ensure that those groups also benefit from economic prosperity. In our Canada-Ukrainian Free Trade Agreement, we do have a chapter on Indigenous peoples. How do you feel about that if it was to be included in something to do with the Ecuador government?
I'm not qualified to assess that clause that you're referring to. What I have said is what is necessary to include in a free trade agreement to ensure that Canada upholds its obligations to human rights and is careful to ensure that trade and investment objectives do not undermine human rights. And that's why I've made the recommendations that I have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's quite an interesting study, in regards to Ecuador being our 51st largest merchandise trade partner with Canadian exports. They're about 600 million, 300 of which is wheat alone, and then refined oil about 164 million. And then exports from Ecuador and into Canada, about $679 million, with crude oil being number one at $178 million, and then precious metals at $150. Mr. Walker, you talked about how Cereals Canada is in favor of free trade discussions, looking to see if we could prevent non-tariff barriers in any, future negotiations, address issues such as the 5% tariff that is on oats. In your opening remark, you talked about Canada being, I think, is it the largest supplier of wheat to Ecuador in one category? And what is that again?
Yes, so Ecuador, within Ecuador, Canada has 60% market share for wheat.
Excellent. And so, I mean, I can understand why you said they love Canadian wheat. In terms of that. I mean, in terms of the population and the resource and the requirements that it needs for its population. So those wheat exports are vitally important. Would you not agree?
I would absolutely agree.
Right. And so anything that we can do in terms of increasing access, maintaining access, protecting that access is a net benefit to the population of the Ecuadorian people, I would suggest. Correct?
I would completely agree with you.
Great. Thank you. You know what? I want to ask a question to Ms. Herrera. And I was just looking at an article that she had penned in the summertime, and it deals with the issue of consent and Indigenous support. And you had talked about the process for free, prior, and informed consultation. So I was just wondering, could you explain that process and how it works in Ecuador under their constitution? Oh,
Sorry. We're trying to reconnect.
well, sure, please, Ms. Price.
Yeah. Just to, sorry?
Would Ms. Herrera have had the opportunity to hear that, or she was totally
I had
cut off?
stopped the clock. Why don't you repeat the question so that she has full access to it?
And I'll come back to you, Ms. Price. Thank you. Ms. Herrera, I was reading an article that you had penned earlier, goes back to last summer, and you had talked about the whole process of obtaining Indigenous support and the notion of free, prior, and informed consultation, and that being required as part of the Constitution. You were discussing the Dundee decision of the courts in Ecuador. I was just wondering, could you comment on that and provide a little bit more detail on how that free, prior, and informed consultation process works under the Constitution?
Thank you, Madam, for the question. I'm sorry, I logged out. My computer crashed. Yes, thank you for the question. So, yeah, this case is very concerning. So, for over 20 years, just for a very, very brief context, for over 20 years, communities in the Páramo de Quimsacocha in southern Ecuador have been mobilizing peacefully against Canadian mining companies. Different companies have tried to advance gold projects in these in the highlands. Since then, because of this peaceful resistance for over 10 years, communities have organized themselves and they have called for citizen-led referendums. These are citizen-led referendums that are part of the Constitution, where communities can decide whether they want extractive mega projects in their territories. In the last 10 years, at least 3 citizen-led referendums have been organized by the communities, and in all of them, over at least between 70 and 80, and in one of them, 90% of the population have voted against Canadian mining. In terms of answering your question, yes, last year, and actually just a few weeks ago, Dundee Precious Metals, their Loma Larga project in the Páramo, there was a constitutional order that confirmed the suspension of the project. Why? Because the communities, indigenous communities, were not consulted. The project didn't get the free, prior, and informed consent by the communities. Because of that, for over 1.5 years, first the provincial court, then the local court, the provincial court, and now the constitutional court, the 3 courts have reaffirmed that there was no free, prior, and informed consent by the indigenous communities. In fact, we are aware that at some point the company denied the existence of indigenous peoples in the Páramo de Quimsacocha. So because of all of this, as you see, this is one of the reasons why communities in Ecuador don't want extractive mega projects in their territories when they already have said no to them, right? That's why one of our recommendations, one of our asks is that we echo communities when they say that if they already say no to mining projects, their rights to say no must be respected. And I would like to echo very briefly that we need Canada, and we need to hear from folks in Ecuador. There has not been an opportunity for communities in Ecuador to voice their concerns regarding this free trade agreement. If we are talking about an inclusive free trade agreement, voices from Ecuador need to be part of this conversation. So far, that has not been the case.
Okay.
In Ecuador.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sheehan for 5 minutes. Mr. Sheehan, we can't hear you. Can you unplug and replug your system? Throw a question.
Sure. While we wait for Mr. Sheehan to come back, Mr. Walker, I've heard great things about the lab, and I hope to visit one day in Winnipeg. But can you just maybe speak to the work or the innovative work that you're doing to innovate Canadian products for markets around the world?
The question. So our team of technical experts, we have about 18 to 20 of them on staff. They do fantastic work working with our customers around the world to make sure that where they're using our products, they're doing so in the most effective way possible. So that's everything from reducing milling cycles, depending on the end product they want to use, to helping them troubleshoot with, water absorption or, different rise times. And really, our staff there that have the science backing are helping our customers daily to make the best use of products.
And one question to you is, in terms of, you mentioned 84 countries around the world that your membership to. What's the latest countries that you've been opening up markets into?
So we regularly travel to our core markets to do a variety of different work with them, but we're always happy to engage with new markets, not just on more traditional aspects, but also existing customers who might be interested in new different areas. So just this past year, several months ago, China purchased 200 metric tons of Canadian durum, which is something we're really excited about. I mean, obviously that's a bit of a drop in the bucket compared to other markets, but having that market look at new ways that they can integrate that into their existing supply chains is very positive.
Okay, I think we have Mr. Sheehan back on. Okay, Mr. Sheehan, please, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes left.
I apologize. I must have unplugged. There's about 25,000 Ecuadorian Canadians living in Canada. We have a few in Sault Ste. Marie. I mean, they're leaders in the community, part of the Latin Association as well, and very, very, very proud of their country. Some of them see this as a great opportunity to raise people up, in particular. And I wanted to ask, Chair, to our presenters, Ecuador had joined the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, the GTAGA, May 15th, as a means to work closely with Canada, but also Chile, Colombia, Mexico, New Zealand, and Peru to promote gender-responsive trade policies and advance gender equality and women's economic empowerment. And on the same day, they also joined the Inclusive Trade Action Group, CIIT, in order to work together with those said partners, Canada, Chile, Mexico, and New Zealand, to help make international trade policies more inclusive in order to ensure that the benefits of trade investments are more broadly shared. And I think that is what we ought to be always looking for in our trade agreements. So to the panelists, do you have any comments on those two agreements? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. What I would say is what I have said earlier, that it's very important to ask Ecuadorian women organizations to answer that question for you. Amazonian women, defenders of the forest, ask them what they would say about what you're asking, and what they would say about the regulatory environment in Ecuador to guarantee their rights. Thank you.
Any other panelists would like to make a comment on those two recently entered in agreements?
Guess not.
Okay, so my next question will be for the Grain Growers Happy Agricultural Day. And we're also studying the supply chains in another study. But if you could describe briefly, very specifically, sort of like, and you mentioned a few of the places where the grains are grown, but how are they shipped? What ports are they exiting from? And how well are the grain shipments being delivered to Ecuador?
Thank you for the question. Infrastructure is of critical importance to our industry and top priority for Cereals Canada. We travel around the world, as I've mentioned, meet with our customers every year, and they always want to know how rail delivery is going in Canada. So this is a top priority for us. We appreciate the interswitching pilot that the government brought in last year. we would highlight a great opportunity to extend the pilot to up to 30 months to improve competition within Canada and help reduce delivery times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses for starting our very important study. Very valuable information. So thank you to all of the witnesses. We will excuse the witnesses so that we can go in camera and deal with the travel budget and the Vancouver brief. Thank you. So I will suspend momentarily.